There's something quietly devastating about watching someone you love panic over Valentine's Day. Not because they forgot, but because they remembered. Because somewhere in their chest there's this tightness, this low hum of anxiety that whispers, if I don't get this right, if I don't make this special enough, maybe I'm not enough. And you want to tell them it's okay, that they don't have to perform, that love isn't a stage, but you can't, because they've been trained their entire life to believe that love is something you prove on specific dates, at specific times, with specific gestures. And if you don't, well, then maybe you never loved them at all. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody talks about. The people who don't make a big deal out of Valentine's Day, the ones who treat February 14th like any other Thursday, who don't scramble for reservations or panic buy roses at gas stations, they're not cold. They're not unromantic. They're not commitment phobes hiding behind cynicism. They're just the ones who figured something out, something that the rest of us are still desperately trying to learn. They understand that love isn't a holiday. It's a practice. And practices don't wait for calendars to give them permission to exist. You see, there's this strange phenomenon that happens every year around mid-February. Suddenly, the world divides itself into two camps. There are the people who go all out, the ones who plan elaborate surprises, who book restaurants months in advance, who spend hours agonizing over the perfect gift. And then there are the others, the ones who shrug, who say, it's just a day. And we've been conditioned to see them as the problem, as if not participating in this collective performance of love is somehow evidence of emotional unavailability, as if treating your partner well every other day of the year isn't enough, as if consistency is less valuable than spectacle. But what if we've been looking at this backwards? What if the people who don't make a big deal out of Valentine's Day aren't the ones who love less, but the ones who understand love differently? What if they're the ones who've realized that a relationship can't survive on one day of grand gestures and 364 days of autopilot? What if they're the ones who figured out that love is not a burst of fireworks, but a steady flame? And steady flames don't need a holiday to remind them to keep burning. Let me tell you what nobody explains when you're young. They tell you that love is supposed to feel like magic, like butterflies and fireworks and overwhelming emotion. And it does, sometimes. But what they don't tell you is that love, real love, the kind that lasts, feels a lot more like making coffee the way they like it even when you're exhausted. It feels like listening to the same story they've told you 5 times because you know they need to process it out loud. It feels like noticing when they're quiet in a bad way versus quiet in a good way. It feels like showing up, again and again and again, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching. John Gottman spent decades studying couples, thousands of them, watching how they interacted, how they fought, how they loved. And what he found was this: the couples who stayed together, who built something that lasted, weren't the ones who had the most passion or the most romance or the most dramatic declarations of love. They were the ones who mastered something he called bids for connection. Tiny, almost invisible moments where one person reaches out, emotionally, not physically, and the other person responds. One person says, "Look at that bird," and the other person looks. One person sighs, and the other person asks, "What's wrong?" One person mentions they're stressed about work, and the other person remembers to ask about it later. These moments are so small they're almost forgettable, but they're everything. Because what Gottman discovered is that relationships aren't built on grand gestures. They're built on thousands of micro-connections, on the accumulation of tiny moments where you choose each other, where you turn toward each other instead of away. And the couples who thrived, they did this constantly, every single day. The couples who didn't, they saved it all up for birthdays, for anniversaries, for Valentine's Day. They put all their relationship energy into 1 or 2 big moments and wondered why the rest of the year felt hollow.
And that's the trap, isn't it? Valentine's Day becomes this thing we use to compensate, to prove, to perform. It becomes the relationship equivalent of cramming for an exam you should have been studying for all semester. You ignore the daily readings, skip the practice problems, and then pull an all-nighter before the test, hoping that one intense burst of effort will be enough. And maybe you pass, maybe you scrape by, but you didn't actually learn anything. You didn't build the foundation, you just performed well enough to avoid failure. There's research on this. When psychologists studied couples who felt pressured to be romantic on specific dates, Valentine's Day, anniversaries, New Year's Eve, they found something unsettling. That pressure, that obligation, actually decreased relationship satisfaction. They called it prescribed relationship behaviors. And what it revealed is that your brain knows the difference. It knows when you're doing something because you genuinely want to versus when you're doing it because you feel like you have to. When love becomes a checklist item, when it becomes something you do to avoid guilt or judgment or conflict, it stops feeling like love. It starts feeling like labor, like performance, like proof. And that's where the real damage happens. Because when Valentine's Day becomes this test, this ultimate measure of whether you're a good partner, whether your relationship is solid, whether you love each other enough, you're no longer celebrating love. You're defending against the fear that maybe you don't have it. Psychologists call this symbolic self-completion theory. When we feel insecure about something, we try to compensate with symbolic gestures. We try to prove through external actions that we possess the internal qualities we're afraid we lack. So if you're worried you're not a good partner, you buy the expensive gift. If you're anxious your relationship isn't strong, you plan the elaborate date. If you're scared they might leave, you perform. You perform so well that maybe, just maybe, they won't notice the cracks underneath. But here's what's devastating about that. The performance replaces the reality. The symbol becomes more important than the substance. You stop asking, am I actually showing up for this person every day? And start asking, did I do enough on February 14th? You stop building intimacy and start building proof. And the thing about proof is that it's never enough, because proof is for other people. Proof is for the version of your relationship that exists on Instagram, in group chats, in the stories you tell at dinner parties. But your actual relationship, the one that exists in your living room on a Tuesday night when you're both tired and there's nothing to talk about and you're just there, together, that relationship doesn't need proof, it needs presence. And this is where social comparison theory comes in. Leon Festinger identified this back in 1954, but it's so much worse now. We're constantly comparing, constantly measuring ourselves against other people's relationships. And when Valentine's Day hits and your feed is flooded with roses and surprise trips and elaborate photo shoots and declarations of love that sound like they were written by poets, you start to feel like your relationship is lacking. Like maybe you should be doing more. Like maybe your partner deserves someone who would plan something bigger, something better, something more. Even though you know, logically, rationally, that nobody posts about the boring parts. Nobody shares the Tuesday nights when you sit in silence because you're both too tired to talk. Nobody photographs the moment when they're upset and you just hold space for them without trying to fix it. Nobody broadcasts the small, quiet acts of love that actually hold a relationship together.
But your brain doesn't care about logic. Your brain sees the highlight reel and starts to panic. And suddenly, Valentine's Day isn't about celebrating your relationship anymore. It's about competing, about proving that your love is just as valid, just as real, just as worthy as everyone else's. And that's exhausting, because you can't compete with a performance. You can't win a game where the rules keep changing based on what everyone else is doing. And more importantly, you shouldn't have to. Because here's what Eli Finkel and his colleagues found when they studied what actually makes relationships satisfying. It's not the expensive dinners or the elaborate vacations or the grand romantic gestures. It's shared novel experiences. It's doing new things together. And those things don't have to be big. They don't have to be Instagrammable. They just have to be new. Trying a recipe you've never made before, walking a different route through your neighborhood, learning something together, building something together, growing together. That's what creates intimacy. That's what builds connection. Not the price tag, not the spectacle, just the experience of discovering something new while standing next to each other. And yet we've convinced ourselves that love has to be big, that it has to be loud, that it has to be visible. We've turned Valentine's Day into this referendum on whether your relationship measures up, when the truth is that relationships don't live in single days. They live in the accumulation of all the other days, in the moments nobody sees, in the choices you make when it would be easier not to, in the attention you give when you're tired, in the kindness you offer when you're frustrated, in the way you show up again and again, not because it's February 14th, but because it's Tuesday or Wednesday or any other unremarkable day when love isn't trending. And if you're someone who doesn't make a big deal out of Valentine's Day, maybe it's not because you don't care. Maybe it's because you've figured out that making a big deal out of one day is just a way of avoiding the harder work of making a consistent deal out of every day. Maybe you've realized that buying roses once a year doesn't make up for not noticing when they're struggling, that planning an elaborate date doesn't erase the nights you were too distracted to really listen, that performing love on Valentine's Day doesn't replace the daily practice of actually loving someone. And maybe, just maybe, the reason you don't make a big deal out of Valentine's Day is because you don't need to. Because your relationship already knows. Because the love you've built doesn't need a date on the calendar to validate it. Because you've been proving it all along in ways that don't require an audience or a reservation or a receipt. You've been proving it in the quiet, in the mundane, in the invisible architecture of a life built together. But let's talk about what happens when we don't realize this, when we keep treating Valentine's Day like it's the annual performance review for our relationship, because there are consequences to this, real ones. When you put all your emotional energy into one day, the other 364 days start to feel less important. Your brain starts to believe that love is something you schedule, not something you practice. And slowly, imperceptibly, you stop seeing each other. You stop noticing. You stop reaching out in those small ways that Gottman talked about. Because why bother? There's a day for that. There's a designated time to be romantic, to be thoughtful, to be present. And today isn't it.
And the saddest part is that you don't even realize it's happening. You just notice that something feels off, that the connection feels thinner, that you're living parallel lives instead of intertwined ones. And when Valentine's Day comes around again, you try even harder. You plan something even bigger. You spend even more, hoping that this grand gesture will fix whatever's been slowly breaking. But it doesn't, because you can't repair a foundation with decorations. You can't solve a daily problem with an annual solution. And if you're single on Valentine's Day, there's a different kind of pain. Neuroscientists have found that social exclusion activates the same brain regions as physical pain. It's not metaphorical, it's literal. Your brain processes being left out the same way it processes getting hurt. And on Valentine's Day, when it feels like the entire world is celebrating something you don't have, that pain intensifies. But here's what's important to understand. That pain isn't because you're actually alone. It's because you feel like you're supposed to be celebrating something. Remove the expectation, and February 14th is just another day. The suffering isn't inherent to being single. It's manufactured by a collective agreement that this day matters more than others. So what if we stopped agreeing? What if we took all that pressure, all that anxiety, all that performance energy, and redistributed it across the year? What if instead of one massive gesture, we offered 365 small ones? What if love became something we practiced daily, not something we proved annually? Sarah Algo, a psychology professor, studied gratitude in relationships and found something profound. When partners regularly expressed appreciation for each other, not on special occasions, but spontaneously, authentically, both individuals reported feeling more connected and more satisfied. The key word is genuine. Not performative, not obligatory, just real, honest recognition of the other person. And yes, it's harder than buying roses once a year, because it requires actual attention. It requires you to be present even when you're exhausted, even when it's inconvenient, even when nobody's watching. True devotion isn't the elaborate Valentine's dinner. It's the Tuesday afternoon when you're both tired and stressed, and you still choose to be kind. It's remembering they have that meeting they were nervous about and texting them good luck. It's noticing they've been quieter than usual and creating space for them to talk about it, or not talk about it, whatever they need.
It's the accumulation of moments where you choose them, not because a calendar told you to, not because you'll get credit for it, but because that's what love actually is. If this resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of Valentine's Day expectations or the freedom of letting them go, you're not alone. There's a different way to love, one that doesn't wait for permission from holidays, one that lives in the everyday. And maybe that's the most romantic thing of all.